somewhere between 1917 and 1930, in cities on nearly every continent, roughly 1 million people fell asleep in a way medicine had never documented before. Some of them did not wake up again for decades. A few of them, for one strange and fleeting season near the end of the 1960s, seemed to wake up completely and then, one by one, seemed to drift back into that same sleep, in front of the people who loved them. Welcome to Dark-Historium. This is a channel built to help you rest, a soft voice, a slow pace, the kind of long story you can drift off inside without losing anything if your eyes close before the end. Tonight, for once, that isn't just a coincidence. Tonight we're telling the story of a disease that took sleep itself and turned it into something nobody, then or now, has ever been able to fully explain. If this is your first time here, welcome, settle in. There's no rush. If you already know how this works, you know what to do. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let this run as long as you need it to. Nothing here requires you to stay awake for it. If the channel is useful to you, a like helps more than you'd think. And subscribing means this will still be here tomorrow night, if tonight isn't the night you make it to the end. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I do read them, usually the next morning, with coffee. Before we get to Vienna, and to a short medical paper published in the spring of 1917, and to the first 6 patients anyone thought carefully enough to write down, it's worth sitting for a moment with what wasn't yet known. Because for nearly everyone in this story, the beginning looked like almost nothing. A headache, a little more tired than usual. Eyes that ached faintly behind the lids. The sort of complaint a doctor in the winter of 1916 would have listened to for 2 minutes, prescribed rest for, and forgotten by lunch. Rest, it would turn out, was exactly the wrong word for what was coming. There is something about a story like this one that sits differently than most of what gets told on a channel like this. Usually, when we tell you about a mysterious death, or a hidden basement, or a conspiracy history has mostly forgotten, the mystery belongs to one person, or one family, or one house. This one belongs to roughly 1 million people, on nearly every inhabited continent, across a stretch of about 13 years, and to the handful of doctors, decades apart, who each tried, with the tools available to them at the time, to understand what was happening to their patients. Some of what they found still holds up. Some of it didn't survive contact with better science. And some of the central questions they were asking in 1917 are, remarkably, still open questions today, being asked by researchers with tools von Economo could never have imagined. We're going to take this slowly, the way this channel always does, because the story genuinely rewards it. It starts in a hospital ward in Vienna. It ends, much later, in a different hospital ward, several thousand miles away, with an old woman speaking again after more than 40 years of silence. Everything in between is real, documented, and more than most of the stories we tell here still, in its most important respect, unfinished. Consider, for a moment, what it would mean for that to happen to you. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden dramatic seizure, just a growing heaviness behind the eyes. A day that feels longer and slower than it should, and then, gradually, a stillness that your own family would eventually stop expecting you to break. That is not a hypothetical. Between 1917 and 1930, it happened to roughly 1 million people, in cities on nearly every populated continent. And by the time this story ends, you will understand both how much doctors eventually learned from it and how much, even now, they still do not know. This is a story about a disease modern medicine still cannot fully explain, and about the ordinary, unremarkable world it interrupted without warning. It will take you from a quiet clinic in wartime Vienna to a long-term ward in the Bronx, decades later, and it will not offer you a tidy ending, because a tidy ending is not what actually happened. What it will offer is everything the historical record can honestly support, told carefully and told once. The world before. To understand how strange this disease truly was, you first have to understand how much doctors in 1916 already believed they understood about the human brain, and how little of that turned out to help them here. By the early 20th century, neurology was a genuinely proud young science. It had spent the previous 50 years mapping the brain with real precision, which regions governed speech, which controlled movement, which processed vision. Doctors could, by then, often predict what a patient would lose function of based on where a stroke or a tumor sat inside the skull. There was a real, earned confidence in the profession that the brain, mysterious as it still was in its deepest workings, was at least a knowable machine. Given enough careful observation, symptoms could be traced back to causes. That confidence sat inside a Europe that was, in the winter of 1916, exhausted in almost every other way. The First World War was in its third year. Millions of men were entrenched across a front that stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, and the casualty lists arriving in Vienna, in Paris, in London, in Berlin, had already numbed a continent to scale in a way it had never experienced before. Hospitals were full of wounded soldiers. Doctors were stretched thin, many of the most capable of them pulled into military medical service. Food was rationed in most of the belligerent countries. Coal was scarce. The ordinary rhythms of civilian medicine, the kind of slow, careful clinical observation that had built neurology's reputation, were, in a great many places, barely holding together. It was into this exhausted, wartime medical world that a new set of symptoms began arriving, quietly, in ones and twos, in the psychiatric and neurological wards of Vienna. It's worth remembering, too, what medicine in 1916 could not yet do. Antibiotics did not exist. The first, penicillin, was still more than a decade from even its accidental discovery, let alone practical use. Viruses themselves were barely understood as distinct biological entities, the tools to see them, to isolate them, to sequence their genetic material, belonged to a scientific future nobody in that Vienna clinic could have predicted with any precision. When a doctor of the period suspected an infectious cause for a patient's symptoms, there was, in the vast majority of cases, no way to confirm it directly. Diagnosis rested almost entirely on what could be observed at the bedside: fever, pulse, the pattern and progression of symptoms, and, after death, whatever an autopsy could reveal to the naked eye, and, if the hospital was well equipped, to a basic microscope. This was a medicine of careful observation, not of laboratory certainty, which is precisely why the clinical notes from this period, however incomplete by modern standards, remain so valuable. They are, in a very real sense, the only eyes we have left on what actually happened. Vienna in 1916 was still, despite the war, one of the great centers of medical science in the world. The University of Vienna's medical faculty had trained or influenced a significant share of the leading physicians in Europe. Its psychiatric neurological clinic, the institution at the center of this story, sat inside a broader tradition of extraordinarily careful, almost obsessive clinical note-taking. Doctors who believed, correctly, that if you wrote down exactly what you saw, in exactly the order you saw it, Patterns that were invisible in any single case might become visible across many. That tradition mattered enormously, because the disease that was about to be described there did not announce itself. It crept in, disguised as things doctors already knew. Some early patients looked, at first glance, like they were developing meningitis, the fever, the headache, the stiff neck. Others looked like unusually severe cases of influenza, of which there was already plenty circulating that winter, in the years just before the far larger and far more famous influenza pandemic of 1918 would arrive. Still others looked, distressingly, like early psychiatric breakdowns, patients becoming withdrawn, apathetic, strangely slow to respond, in ways that could plausibly be mistaken for depression or for the beginning of a psychotic episode. It was this confusing overlap, a disease that could resemble 3 or 4 completely different, already understood conditions, depending on which patient you happened to be looking at, that made it so difficult to see clearly at first. Individual doctors, seeing individual patients, each drew on their own training and their own recent experience to explain what they saw. A psychiatrist saw psychiatric symptoms. An infectious disease specialist saw an infection. Nobody, yet, was looking across cases and asking whether they might all be looking at the same thing. There is a particular kind of medical blindness that happens this way, and it happens more often than most people realize, even today. A hospital is not one continuous set of eyes looking at every patient. It is dozens of individual doctors, each seeing a handful of cases, each filing those cases under the categories their training gives them. A disease that mimics several existing categories at once can move through a population for a surprisingly long time before anyone with the right vantage point, someone seeing enough cases across enough categories to notice the common thread, happens to be looking in the right direction. Measles was hiding in plain sight for centuries before germ theory gave doctors a reason to connect its scattered presentations. Multiple sclerosis took decades to be recognized as one disease rather than several unrelated conditions. What was different, and what makes this story possible to tell with any precision at all, is that in this case, the doctor in the right position to notice the pattern happened to be working in one of the most rigorously observant clinical traditions in the world, at almost exactly the moment the pattern became dense enough in one place to be seen. That was about to change, in one clinic, over one unusually difficult winter, and it was about to change because one neurologist noticed something the individual symptoms alone did not explain: a pattern in how patients moved, or, more precisely, in when and how they stopped. There's a reason the world of 1917 was particularly unprepared to recognize a new neurological epidemic quickly, and it has to do with what else was competing for medical and public attention at that exact moment. Europe was entering the 4th year of the First World War. Hospitals across the continent were already stretched thin treating combat casualties, and public health authorities were focused overwhelmingly on the war's direct toll: infectious disease outbreaks in crowded military camps, malnutrition in besieged cities, and the general strain a continent-wide war placed on every part of the medical system. A strange new illness producing sleepiness and eye movement abnormalities in a comparatively small number of civilian patients in Vienna simply did not compete in early 1917 for the kind of urgent, resourced attention it might have received in peacetime. This context matters for understanding why the epidemic's early spread was documented unevenly across different countries. Wartime censorship disrupted communication between medical institutions in opposing countries, And the simple fact that so many young physicians who might otherwise have been publishing detailed case reports were serving in military medical units instead, all meant that the disease's true early spread across Europe is harder to reconstruct with confidence than it would be for an epidemic occurring in ordinary peacetime conditions. Some historians studying this period have reasonably suggested that the epidemic may have been spreading, under-recognized, in more places, and for longer than the surviving written record can fully confirm, though this remains, honestly, an inference rather than a settled fact, since the evidence needed to confirm or rule it out has, for the most part, not survived. The world of 1917 was, in other respects too, a world without most of the basic tools a modern epidemiologist would consider essential to tracking a new disease. There was no coordinated international disease reporting system of the kind that exists today. No shared standard for what symptoms should trigger a case report, and no rapid means of communicating suspected clusters between cities, let alone between countries on opposite sides of an active war. A cluster of unusual cases in Vienna, and a similar cluster appearing around the same time in another European city, might easily have gone unconnected for months, simply because the infrastructure to compare them quickly did not exist. This is part of why reconstructing the epidemic's true earliest spread remains, a century later, an exercise in careful inference from fragmentary surviving records, rather than a matter of consulting a single authoritative source. It is also worth remembering that 1917 was itself only months away from the beginning of an entirely separate, far larger, and far more thoroughly documented pandemic, the influenza pandemic that would begin spreading globally in 1918 and go on to kill tens of millions of people worldwide. The near overlap of these two events, one a comparatively contained neurological epidemic, and the other among the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, has fueled decades of scientific speculation about whether they might somehow be connected. That question, and why it has never been definitively resolved in either direction, is one this story will return to directly. The first cases. The neurologist's name was Konstantin von Economo. He was in his late 30s in the winter of 1916 and 1917, already an established figure at the University of Vienna's Psychiatric Neurological Clinic, and by most accounts of his career, a meticulous clinical observer, the kind of doctor who did not rush to name something new until the pattern in front of him had become impossible to explain any other way. Von Economo himself was, by the standards of his era, an unusually well-traveled and broadly curious figure, trained not only in medicine, but with real interests that extended into aviation and other fields entirely, the sort of restless, wide-ranging intellect that the early 20th century's scientific culture tended to produce more often than our own more specialized age typically does. None of that background explains what he found in his clinic that winter. What it may help explain is his willingness to trust an observation that didn't fit anything already written down, rather than forcing it into an existing category simply because an existing category was more comfortable to reach for. Between the closing weeks of 1916 and the first months of 1917, von Economo began encountering a small cluster of patients whose presentations, taken individually, might each have been filed under some other diagnosis, but which, taken together, refused to fit cleanly into anything already on the books. The record states that his initial cluster numbered 6 cases. 6 patients, in one clinic, in one winter, sharing a set of features that no existing category quite covered. What these 6 patients had in common was not, at first, the thing you might expect. It was not simply exhaustion. Some of them were profoundly, almost inexplicably sleepy, sinking into sleep during conversations, during meals, sometimes appearing to fall asleep mid-sentence, only to be woken with relative ease and to seem, for a moment, entirely lucid again before drifting back under. But others, in the same small cluster, showed something closer to the opposite: restlessness that would not resolve into sleep at all, an agitation that kept them moving, kept them awake, kept them unable to settle for days at a stretch. Von Economo's genuinely difficult diagnostic task was recognizing that these two, seemingly contradictory presentations, profound sleepiness in some patients, near total sleeplessness in others, were not two different illnesses. They were, he came to argue, two faces of the same one. There was a third clue, and it may have been the one that mattered most. Alongside the sleep disturbance, a number of these patients showed abnormalities in eye movement weakness or paralysis in the muscles that control the eyes, sometimes a fixed, unusually intense stare, sometimes double vision. To a neurologist trained to localize symptoms to specific brain structures, this combination pointed somewhere fairly specific, toward the base of the brain, near the structures that, even by 1917, were already suspected of playing some role in regulating sleep and wakefulness. Whatever this was, it appeared to be striking a particular, relatively deep region of the brain, not a broad, diffuse inflammation, but something with a preference for a specific neighborhood. This was, in its own quiet way, a genuinely important piece of clinical reasoning, and it's worth explaining why. A doctor confronted with a patient who is unusually sleepy has any number of possible explanations available: exhaustion, depression, a dozen ordinary illnesses that leave a person drained. What made von Economo's cluster different was the combination: sleepiness paired specifically with these eye movement abnormalities, in patient after patient. A single symptom can point almost anywhere in the body. A specific combination of symptoms, recurring together across multiple unrelated patients, points somewhere far more precise, and in this case, it pointed toward the midbrain, a small, deep structure that later research would confirm plays a central role in regulating exactly the sleep-wake cycle these patients had lost control of. Von Economo could not have known, in 1917, the detailed modern neuroscience of how that region works. What he had was something almost as valuable: the observation that when this specific cluster of symptoms occurred together, autopsy findings, where they were available, tended to show inflammation concentrated in that same specific area. Symptom and structure were lining up. Von Economo published his findings in April of 1917 in a short paper describing the 6 cases and proposing that they represented a distinct clinical entity, a new disease, or at least a newly recognized one, which he named Encephalitis lethargica, literally, an inflammation of the brain characterized by lethargy. It was, on its face, a modest publication. 6 cases, described carefully, named cautiously. Von Economo was not claiming to have solved anything about the disease's cause. He was doing something narrower and, as it turned out, considerably more consequential. He was giving doctors elsewhere a name to reach for and a specific cluster of features to watch for the next time they saw something that did not fit their existing categories. That act, naming a pattern precisely enough that other doctors in other cities could recognize it in their own confusing cases, is very often how epidemics of unfamiliar disease become visible to medicine at all. A disease can be moving through a population for months, even years, hidden inside a dozen different misdiagnoses, before someone gives it a name specific enough that clinicians everywhere start comparing notes. Once von Economo's 1917 paper reached other clinics in Britain, in France, in the United States, and beyond physicians who had themselves been quietly puzzling over strange, ill-fitting cases of their own, began recognizing the same pattern in their own wards. Reports began accumulating with unusual speed. What had looked, in Vienna in the winter of 1916 and 1917, like 6 unusual patients in one clinic, would within a few years look like something spreading, unmistakably, around the world. In Britain, physicians began describing very similar clusters within a year or two of von Economo's publication, and the disease acquired, alongside its formal name, a popular one that would follow it through the rest of its history: sleepy sickness, or, in some accounts, sleeping sickness, a name that would go on to cause a genuine and recurring confusion, because it is also the popular name for an entirely different disease, a parasitic infection spread by the tsetse fly in parts of Africa unrelated to Encephalitis lethargica in cause, geography, or mechanism, sharing only the same unfortunate name and a superficial resemblance in one of its symptoms. We'll come back to that distinction, because it matters, and because it is one of the more common ways this story gets garbled in retelling even today. In France, in the United States, and steadily further afield, similar reports followed the same pattern. Doctors who had been quietly filing confusing cases under other diagnoses began, once von Economo's description was in wide circulation, recognizing the same cluster in their own patients. By the early 1920s, cases had been documented not just across Europe and North America, but in India, in parts of East Asia, and elsewhere, a genuinely global pattern, as best the incomplete surviving records allow us to reconstruct it, rather than a localized European phenomenon. This global spread is itself one of the more striking and least well-remembered features of the whole story. A disease that reached, in the space of a decade, very nearly every part of the inhabited world that kept the kind of medical records capable of recognizing it, while remaining, even at that scale, comparatively obscure in popular memory today, next to the far more famous influenza pandemic unfolding across almost exactly the same years. The strongest available evidence suggests the disease had likely been present, in scattered and unrecognized form, slightly before von Economo's cluster. Some later researchers and historians have pointed to isolated cases and even small local outbreaks in the years just prior. But 1917 is the year the disease acquired a name, a clinical description precise enough to be recognized elsewhere, and from that point forward a documented, traceable presence in the medical literature of country after country. For the purposes of this story, that is where Encephalitis lethargica, as something the world could see and respond to, begins. Von Economo's initial report, presented to the Vienna Psychiatric Society in the spring of 1917, did not claim to have identified a new disease out of thin air. Isolated cases resembling it had, in fact, appeared in scattered medical literature going back years, described under a variety of other names by doctors who had no way of knowing they were looking at related cases of the same underlying condition. What made von Economo's report different was not the discovery of an entirely unprecedented symptom picture, but the recognition of a pattern across multiple simultaneous cases in one city, in one season, the kind of clustering that transforms a medical curiosity into a public health question. It's worth understanding a little about who von Economo was, because his particular background shaped how carefully this initial cluster got documented. Konstantin von Economo was, by the time of these first cases, an experienced neurologist and neuroanatomist with a research background in brain structure, not simply a general physician encountering unusual symptoms without the training to characterize them precisely. That background mattered. It meant the first written descriptions of this disease came from someone equipped to note fine distinctions in eye movement, muscle tone, and reflexes, details a less specialized observer might easily have missed or described only in vague, general terms. Much of what later doctors around the world used to recognize the disease in their own patients traced directly back to the precision of these early clinical descriptions. Two faces of one disease. It's worth pausing here, before the epidemic widens, to sit with what encephalitis lethargica actually did to a human body, because understanding its two faces is the key to understanding almost everything that follows, including, eventually, why it was so hard to treat, and why, decades later, a small number of its survivors could be reached again at all. The disease's hallmark, the feature that gave it both its clinical name and its popular one, sleepy sickness, a name history would later attach to it, sometimes confusingly, was its effect on the brain's regulation of sleep. In what doctors came to think of as the classic, most recognizable form, patients became profoundly, almost supernaturally drowsy, not simply tired in the way exhaustion makes a person tired, but drawn towards sleep, with what families and nurses often described as an almost magnetic pull. A patient might be woken for a meal, eat a few bites while apparently alert and aware, answer a question sensibly, and then, mid-conversation, their eyes would begin to close again, their head would tip forward, and they would be, once more, asleep. In severe cases, patients could be roused this way for only brief windows before slipping back under, hour after hour, day after day, for weeks. This was the face of the disease that gave it its lasting name. But this is the detail that made the disease genuinely bewildering to the doctors, trying to treat it in real time, an overlapping and in some ways more disturbing minority of patients experience something close to the opposite. These patients could not sleep at all. They became restless, agitated, sometimes strikingly hyperactive, pacing wards for days, unable to settle even when exhausted, sometimes becoming disoriented or confused as the sleeplessness wore on. Some patients moved between the two states over the course of their illness, profound sleepiness giving way, days or weeks later, to agitated wakefulness, or the reverse. Picture, for a moment, what a single hospital ward treating this disease in, say, 1919 or 1920 would actually have looked and sounded like, based on what the surviving clinical accounts describe. In one bed, a patient who could barely be roused, sinking back into sleep within moments of waking, their breathing slow and even. A few beds away, another patient, same disease, same causal process, as best doctors of the period could tell, pacing, restless, unable to lie still, kept awake by something in their own nervous system that would not let go. Nurses and attendants caring for these wards were, in effect, managing two nearly opposite sets of needs simultaneously, under a single diagnosis that, on paper, looked as though it should produce one consistent picture. It did not. And that inconsistency, more than almost anything else about the disease, is what made building a clear, shared understanding of it among doctors working in different cities, seeing different slices of the same pattern, so difficult in real time. For physicians trained to expect a disease to behave consistently, to present the same way in most of the patients who had it, encephalitis lethargica's dual, almost contradictory personality, was itself a diagnostic trap. A doctor who had only seen the sleepy form might completely fail to recognize the same disease in a patient presenting with agitation and insomnia. This is very likely part of why so many early cases were misdiagnosed, sometimes as psychiatric illness, sometimes as other infections entirely, and why building an accurate picture of how many people the disease had actually affected would prove, as we'll see, genuinely difficult, then and now. Beyond the sleep disturbance itself, the disease frequently produced disturbances in movement and muscle control that echoed, in ways doctors of the time found genuinely eerie, a condition already known to medicine: Parkinson's disease. Patients could develop tremor, muscular rigidity, a slowing and stiffening of voluntary movement, and in some of the disease's most severe and lasting cases, something close to a frozen, statue-like stillness. Patients whose faces lost their normal mobility and expressiveness, whose bodies could be moved into a position by another person and would then, disconcertingly, hold that position, almost like a mannequin, until moved again. And this connection to Parkinsonian symptoms was not incidental. It would turn out, decades later, to be the thread that connected this obscure, largely forgotten epidemic to one of the more remarkable medical stories of the 20th century. But that thread does not become visible yet. In the acute epidemic years, what doctors were confronting was simply this: a disease that could put a patient to sleep for weeks, or rob them of sleep entirely, that could, in its wake, leave some patients with tremor and rigidity, resembling a disease usually seen in the elderly, now appearing in children and young adults, and that, in a meaningful proportion of cases, killed. There was a further dimension to the disease that doctors of the period found especially unsettling, and that deserves mention here because it shaped how families, as much as physicians, experienced what was happening. Encephalitis lethargica could produce marked changes in behavior and personality, particularly in children who survived it. Doctors and parents alike documented cases where a child who had been, before the illness, easygoing and even-tempered, emerged from encephalitis lethargica with a personality that seemed genuinely altered, increased impulsivity, behavioral difficulties, in some documented cases, a kind of restless aggression that had not been present before. This was, understandably, one of the most painful aspects of the disease for families to reckon with. A child who had physically recovered, who could walk and speak and appeared, superficially, to be themselves again, but who seemed, in some fundamental way, to have come back changed, a reminder that this disease's damage was not limited to the visible, external symptoms of sleep and movement, but reached into something harder to name, and harder, for a grieving or bewildered family, to explain to anyone outside their own household. The strongest available evidence places overall mortality during the acute phase of the illness at roughly a third of those who developed it, a genuinely severe rate for what had, in many patients, begun with symptoms as mild as a headache and a little extra fatigue. For those who survived the acute illness, the story did not necessarily end with recovery. A substantial number of survivors were left with lasting neurological damage, tremor, rigidity, changes in personality and behavior that families and doctors alike struggled to make sense of, and, as we'll come to later in this story, a smaller number were left in a far more extreme and lasting condition that would not be fully understood or meaningfully addressed for another 4 decades. The two symptom patterns doctors were documenting, the lethargic form that gave the disease its name, and the agitated, sleepless form that seemed, on the surface, to be its opposite, created real diagnostic confusion in hospitals that had not yet learned to recognize both as expressions of the same underlying illness. A patient arriving restless, agitated, and unable to sleep looked, to a doctor unfamiliar with the still emerging pattern, like a case of acute mania or a severe agitated psychosis conditions, with an entirely different set of expected causes and treatments. It was only as case series accumulated, and as doctors began comparing notes across institutions, that the underlying commonality became clear. Both presentations involved damage to the same general brain regions governing sleep-wake regulation, just expressed in opposite clinical directions, depending on precisely which structures within those regions were most affected in a given patient. This diagnostic ambiguity had real consequences for patients. Some who presented with the agitated, sleepless form were, in the epidemic's early years, misdiagnosed with primary psychiatric illness and treated accordingly, a documented source of both delayed correct diagnosis and, in some cases, genuine harm, since the treatments considered appropriate for a psychiatric agitation case were not well suited to a patient whose underlying problem was viral or inflammatory brain damage. It's worth being honest that this misdiagnosis pattern is one of the more troubling threads running through this epidemic's medical history, not because doctors of the period were incompetent, but because the disease itself was genuinely unprecedented, and diagnostic categories that seem obvious in hindsight had not yet been established for anyone to reliably use. Contemporary case records from hospitals in Vienna, London, and Paris, surviving in varying degrees of completeness, describe both symptom clusters appearing sometimes in the same institution within the same season, occasionally even evolving from one form into the other in a single patient over the course of their illness, a detail that helped later observers recognize the two presentations as points on a single spectrum rather than genuinely separate diseases. Named patient statistics on their own, a third dying, roughly 1 million affected worldwide, across the epidemic's run, though, as we'll come back to shortly, even that headline figure is genuinely disputed among the sources that survive, can make a disease feel abstract. It's worth slowing down here, for one case, to make it less abstract. It's worth naming, too, why this part of the story is harder to tell with full confidence than the epidemiology surrounding it. The medical culture of the 1910s and 1920s did not generally publish patients' full names alongside their case histories, a norm rooted partly in what we would now recognize as an early, informal version of patient privacy, and partly in simple professional convention. What survives, instead, is something closer to a composite portrait. Dozens of individual case notes, each carefully observed and dated, describing age, occupation, family circumstance, and the day-by-day arc of illness, but rarely a full name attached. This script will not invent identifying detail the record doesn't support, and it won't present a composite pattern as though it were one fully documented individual's confirmed biography. What follows is drawn honestly from that pattern. The clinical literature from the acute epidemic years, particularly from von Economo's own clinic, and from the hospitals in Britain and France that began documenting cases soon after, contains detailed case notes on individual patients' records kept, again, in that meticulous continental European medical tradition, precisely because doctors sensed they were documenting something genuinely new. These records do not give us patients' full identities in most cases, in keeping with the medical documentation norms of the period. What they preserve instead is clinical detail, age, occupation, the day-by-day progression of symptoms, and the doctor's own uncertainty, recorded almost in real time, about what they were watching happen to another human being. One such case, drawn from the broader pattern documented across multiple clinics in the epidemic's early years, and here presented as representative, rather than as a single fully identified individual, involved a patient in early adulthood, a young woman, by several accounts, otherwise healthy, who was admitted to a hospital ward complaining of headache and unusual fatigue. Within days, According to the pattern these records repeat again and again, her sleep changed in character entirely. She was, nurses recorded, difficult to keep awake even for meals, and when woken, would answer questions with apparent clarity for a minute or two before her eyes would begin, involuntarily, to close again. Over the following 2 weeks, according to this pattern, her periods of wakefulness shortened. Her family permitted limited visits under wartime and epidemic conditions. Described in accounts collected by clinicians of the period, a sense of watching someone slip further away each time they came, even as, in her brief waking moments, she seemed entirely herself. This is again a representative case, drawn from the documented pattern of the period, rather than a single, fully verified individual biography. The surviving records from 1917 through the early 1920s are clinical rather than personal, and this script does not claim more precision about any single named acute-era patient than the surviving sources support. What the pattern does tell us, reliably, is this. For a meaningful number of families across Europe and, soon, well beyond it, the disease's progression looked exactly like this: an ordinary complaint, a frighteningly fast change in a loved one's basic capacity to stay awake or communicate, and then one of several outcomes: recovery, sometimes full and sometimes shadowed by lasting tremor or stiffness; death, in roughly a third of acute cases; or, for some, a slower slide into the kind of profound, lasting stillness we'll return to later in this story. A second recurring pattern in the case literature involves the hyperactive form of the disease, and it's worth giving it equal weight here, since popular memory of this epidemic has tended to remember only the sleepy form and forget its opposite entirely. Clinicians of the period documented patients again, drawn from a pattern across many individual, largely unnamed cases, rather than a single verified biography who developed the reverse presentation. Agitation that would not resolve, sometimes lasting for days without meaningful rest, accompanied by confusion, occasional hallucination, and in some of the more severe documented instances, a kind of manic restlessness that exhausted the patient physically while never allowing the nervous system the rest it needed to recover. Families and hospital staff caring for these patients faced an entirely different but equally wrenching set of demands. Not watching someone slip away into sleep, but watching someone driven, hour after hour, by a body that would not let them stop. What both patterns share, and what makes this section of the story worth sitting with, rather than rushing past, is the particular cruelty of a disease that so often left cognition relatively intact while dismantling the basic biological rhythm, sleep, wakefulness, rest, that almost every other part of human experience depends on. Doctors of the period repeatedly noted, in case after case, patients who could answer questions sensibly, who recognized family members, who by every available measure retained their sense of self, even as their bodies became unable to reliably sustain either sleep or wakefulness in anything resembling a normal pattern. It is this detail, a mind that remained present, inside a body whose most basic rhythms had come loose, that connects the acute epidemic years directly to the second half of this story, decades later, in a hospital ward in the Bronx. What makes this period genuinely difficult to sit with, even at a century's distance, is not simply the death toll. It's the specific character of the illness, that so many of its patients remained, by every clinical account available, aware, not confused in the way a high fever can make a person confused, not unconscious in the way a coma is unconscious, but present, behind a body that was, increasingly, not answering. Doctors of the period noted this repeatedly. Patients who could be roused to lucid, appropriate conversation, sometimes only for a minute before the pull of sleep, or, in the hyperactive form, the storm of restlessness took over again. It is this detail, more than the mortality figures alone, that gave the disease its particular horror for the doctors and families who lived through it. And it is this same detail that would matter enormously decades later, when a very different kind of doctor walked into a very different kind of ward. Beyond the small number of individual patients whose cases made it into published medical literature, the epidemic's toll fell overwhelmingly on people who left no such record at all: factory workers, school children, domestic servants, soldiers recovering from unrelated wounds who contracted the illness in crowded hospital wards. Most of what survives about these patients is not personal testimony, but institutional paperwork. Admission ledgers, death certificates, the occasional case note file, kept not because any particular patient was thought historically significant, but because record-keeping was simply what hospitals of the period did. It is worth being honest about what this means for a story like this one. The vast majority of the roughly 1 million people encephalitis lethargica affected are, to history, essentially anonymous, present in aggregate statistics, absent from anything resembling an individual account. The patients whose stories can be told in any real detail are, almost without exception, the ones who happen to be treated at teaching hospitals by physicians who published, or who later came under the care of a doctor like Sachs, who had both the training and the professional latitude to document them carefully. This is a genuine bias in the surviving historical record, one this script has tried to name rather than pretend around. The patients we can describe are not necessarily representative of the epidemic's typical victim, only of the small fraction whose circumstances happen to leave a documentable trace. Among the documented cases, certain patterns recur enough to be described with real confidence. Younger patients, including a significant number of children and adolescents, appear disproportionately in the case records describing the most severe post-encephalitic behavioral changes, sudden shifts in temperament, impulse control, and personality that, in some documented cases, proved as disruptive to the patient's life and the lives of their families as the physical Parkinsonian symptoms seen more often in adult survivors. Physicians and educators of the period, working without any modern framework for understanding acquired brain injury in children, often interpreted these behavioral changes through a moral lens rather than a medical one, a documented and, from a modern vantage point, troubling feature of how some young survivors were treated by schools, families, and in a number of cases the legal system, in the years following their acute illness. The gender pattern among documented cases is also worth noting, since it appears consistently enough across different national record sets to be treated as a real, if not fully explained, feature of the epidemic. Several of the larger surviving case series suggest a roughly even split between male and female patients in the acute illness itself, but a somewhat higher proportion of male patients among those who went on to develop the most severe, longest-lasting post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, a pattern noted by contemporary physicians without ever being satisfactorily explained. Modern researchers examining this same pattern have speculated about a range of possible contributing factors, from underlying biological differences in how the specific brain regions affected respond to inflammatory injury, to social and reporting factors that might have caused male patients' long-term symptoms to be documented more consistently than female patients in the record-keeping conventions of the period. Neither explanation has been confirmed, and this remains, honestly, an open descriptive pattern rather than an understood one. Geographic spread followed no single clean pattern either. While Vienna's cases are the best documented, simply because von Economo's original report drew early attention there, surviving records confirm cases across most of Europe, in Britain and Ireland, across North America, and, in smaller but real numbers, in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America, a genuinely global epidemic, not a regional one, even though the density and quality of surviving documentation varies enormously by region. Countries and cities with more developed public health infrastructure at the time generally produced more complete records, which means the geographic picture available to historians today is skewed toward wealthier, more urbanized regions, in a way that almost certainly understates the epidemic's true reach into less documented parts of the world. The search for a cause. From nearly the moment the epidemic became visible as an epidemic rather than a scattering of confusing individual cases, doctors began searching, with real urgency, for what was causing it. And from nearly that same moment, the search ran into a wall that, as we'll see, has never fully come down. The most immediately obvious hypothesis, to doctors working in the years just before and during 1918, involved influenza. This was, after all, exactly the period in which the deadliest influenza pandemic in modern history, the 1918 flu, was moving through the same wartime, densely mobilized populations that Encephalitis lethargica was also moving through. The timing overlap was striking enough that many physicians of the period assumed, reasonably, that the two must be connected, that Encephalitis lethargica might be some kind of neurological complication of influenza infection, a rare but devastating way the flu virus could, in a subset of patients, attack the brain directly rather than the lungs. It was a genuinely reasonable hypothesis, and it shaped how the disease was understood and treated for years. Doctors at the time reasoned, sensibly enough, that two unprecedented epidemics arriving in the same population within roughly the same 18-month window were unlikely to be pure coincidence, and for decades afterward, the disease was informally linked to influenza in a great deal of medical writing and public memory, to the point that many general historical accounts of the 1918 flu pandemic mention Encephalitis lethargica only as a strange neurological footnote to the larger, more famous outbreak, implicitly treating the two as part of one connected story. But the sources disagree here, and this matters that disagreement has never fully resolved, even with the benefit of a century of subsequent research, and, more recently, the ability to test preserved tissue samples using techniques von Economo's generation could not have imagined. Multiple lines of modern research have looked for direct evidence of influenza virus in preserved brain tissue from Encephalitis lethargica victims, and have not found the kind of clear, consistent signal you would expect if influenza were straightforwardly the cause. Some researchers examining the historical timeline in detail have also pointed out that documented cases consistent with Encephalitis lethargica appear to predate the 1918 flu pandemic's arrival by at least a year, which sits awkwardly with a theory that treats the neurological disease as simply a complication of the respiratory one. The timing overlap between the two epidemics, in other words, may be exactly that, a coincidence of two different diseases moving through the same crowded, wartime world at the same historical moment, rather than proof of a causal link. This is a genuinely uncomfortable place for a story to sit, and it's worth naming that discomfort directly, rather than smoothing past it. It would make for a tidier narrative if the two great medical disasters of that era turned out to share one single cause, one villain, one virus, responsible for both the influenza dead and the Encephalitis lethargica dead. The evidence, honestly weighed, does not support that tidiness. Two catastrophes, unfolding across the same exhausted, wartime world at nearly the same time, appear on the best available evidence to have been, for the most part, two separate stories that happen to overlap. Having found the influenza hypothesis unconfirmed, later researchers pursued other possibilities, and this pursuit has continued, in fits and starts, for the better part of a century. One line of investigation has focused on enteroviruses, a family of viruses known to be capable of causing various forms of brain and nervous system inflammation, and one that some researchers have argued fits certain features of the historical epidemic more comfortably than influenza does. Another, more recent line of investigation has focused not on identifying a specific infectious culprit at all, but on the possibility that Encephalitis lethargica represented an autoimmune process, a case where the body's own immune system, perhaps triggered by a prior infection of almost any kind, mistakenly turned against structures within the brain itself. This autoimmune hypothesis has gained real traction in recent decades, in part because of a separate but strikingly similar modern condition, a rarer disease in which patients develop symptoms substantially overlapping those seen in the historical Encephalitis lethargica epidemic, and which has been definitively shown, in that modern condition, to be autoimmune in nature, raising the question of whether the historical epidemic may have been an early, unrecognized instance of a similar underlying mechanism. What no researcher in any of these lines of investigation, across more than 100 years of study, has been able to do is settle the question definitively. This is worth stating plainly, because it would be easy, in telling this story, to reach for a tidy answer the historical record simply does not support. No surviving record, clinical, epidemiological, or, in recent decades, molecular, tells us with confidence exactly what caused encephalitis lethargica, why it moved through the world with the intensity it did, across roughly a decade and a half, or why, as we'll come to shortly, it appeared to recede almost as mysteriously as it arrived. There is a particular kind of unease in sitting with a mystery, this old and this well-studied and still this unresolved. Doctors in 1918 tried to solve it and failed. Researchers with the tools of the 1960s tried and failed. Researchers today, with genetic sequencing technology none of the disease's original victims could have conceived of, have narrowed the range of plausible explanations, but they have not closed the case. Encephalitis lethargica remains, by the honest account of the modern scientific literature, one of the significant unsolved mysteries in the history of infectious and neurological disease. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that is. Medical science, over the past century, has solved genuinely difficult mysteries, far older and, in some respects, far more obscure than this one. The cause of scurvy, a killer of sailors for centuries, was eventually traced to a simple vitamin deficiency. The cause of pellagra, another mysterious epidemic disease that baffled American doctors for decades, in the early 20th century, was identified as a nutritional deficiency by a single dogged researcher working with far cruder tools than modern medicine has today. Even diseases that once seemed as mysterious and frightening as this one, polio, for instance, eventually yielded their secrets to sustained scientific attention. Encephalitis lethargica has, so far, not yielded in the same way, despite over a century of attention from some of the best resourced medical research institutions in the world. That persistence of mystery is not, in itself, evidence of anything sinister or unusual about the disease's origin. Some medical mysteries simply resist solution longer than others, for reasons that can be as mundane as the destruction or loss of the physical evidence that might once have settled the question. But it does mean that anyone who tells you, with full confidence, exactly what caused this epidemic is telling you more than the evidence currently supports. The search for a cause proceeded, in these early years, along several parallel tracks, each pursued by researchers working with the best tools available to them at the time, tools that, measured against what a modern virology laboratory can do, were genuinely limited. Electron microscopy, which would eventually allow scientists to directly visualize viruses far too small for any light microscope to resolve, did not yet exist in any usable form. It would not become a practical laboratory tool until the following decade, and would not be widely applied to questions like this one until decades after that. Researchers investigating Encephalitis lethargica in the 1920s were, in a very real sense, trying to identify an invisible cause using instruments that could not see it, no matter how carefully they looked. Some researchers pursued the hypothesis that a specific, identifiable virus was responsible, attempting to transmit the disease to laboratory animals using material taken from affected patients, in the hope that a successful transmission would let them isolate and study the causative agent directly. These efforts produced mixed and, ultimately, inconclusive results. Some experiments appeared to produce encephalitis-like symptoms in animals, but the findings proved difficult to replicate reliably across different laboratories. A red flag, by the standards of the scientific method even then, that something in the experimental design or the underlying hypothesis was not fully sound. Other researchers focused less on identifying a specific pathogen and more on documenting the disease's pattern of spread, hoping that careful epidemiological mapping, which cities, which seasons, which population groups were affected first and most severely, might reveal clues about transmission that laboratory work alone could not. None of these approaches, pursued individually or in combination, produced a confirmed answer before the epidemic itself receded, and by the time later generations of researchers had the tools that might have settled the question, the epidemic was decades in the past, and the population of patients available for fresh study had shrunk to the small number of chronic survivors still living in long-term institutional care, a research population that could confirm the disease's long-term neurological consequences with real clarity, but that could no longer meaningfully help identify what had caused the original acute illness in the first place. The question of a possible connection to the 1918 influenza pandemic deserves its own honest treatment, since the two events overlapped closely enough in time to invite an obvious hypothesis, that encephalitis lethargica might simply be a neurological complication of influenza infection itself. Researchers investigated this connection extensively, both during the epidemic and in the decades since, and the honest state of the evidence is genuinely mixed. Some patients diagnosed with encephalitis lethargica did have documented recent influenza infection, which lends the hypothesis real plausibility. But careful epidemiological comparison of the two diseases' spread patterns, which cities were hit hardest, in which order, and on what timeline does not line up as cleanly as a simple cause and effect relationship would predict. Encephalitis lethargica's documented emergence in Vienna in early 1917 in fact predates the 1918 influenza pandemic's global spread by more than a year, which is difficult to reconcile with the idea that the influenza pandemic directly caused the neurological epidemic. Some researchers have proposed more complex relationships, that both diseases might share a common, but still unidentified predisposing factor, or that influenza infection might have worsened or unmasked cases of an already circulating separate illness, rather than caused it outright. No version of this hypothesis has achieved anything like scientific consensus, and it remains, by any honest accounting, one of the genuinely unresolved threads in this whole history. The epidemic recedes. And then, roughly a decade and a half after von Economo's first 6 cases, it began, gradually, to stop. This is one of the genuinely strange features of the epidemic's history, and one that has never been satisfactorily explained, any more than its cause has been. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with just how unusual this pattern actually is. When set beside other epidemics, history remembers more clearly. The 1918 influenza pandemic, devastating as it was, followed a recognizable epidemiological arc. Explosive spread, a brutal peak, and then a decline that epidemiologists can trace with reasonable confidence to a combination of built-up population immunity and the virus itself evolving toward less lethal forms, a common pattern in respiratory pandemics. Smallpox, over a much longer timescale, was driven to eventual eradication by a specific, deliberate, traceable public health intervention, vaccination, applied systematically, worldwide, over decades. Diseases that sweep through populations with the intensity Encephalitis lethargica did across the 1920s do not, as a rule, simply vanish. They're usually understood to recede for reasons that make some epidemiological sense: herd immunity building in a population, the pathogen itself mutating into a less virulent form, effective public health intervention breaking the chain of transmission, or some combination of these. With Encephalitis lethargica, none of these explanations sit especially comfortably, because doctors of the period never identified a specific pathogen to track, never developed a vaccine or a treatment that could plausibly account for declining case numbers, and never fully understood how the disease was even transmitted from person to person in the first place, a basic epidemiological question that, remarkably, remains unresolved to this day. What the historical record does show, with reasonable confidence, is a clear decline in newly reported, clearly identifiable cases through the second half of the 1920s, with the epidemic generally considered to have largely run its course by around 1930, though. Consistent with the time frame uncertainty already noted in this story, different sources place this ending point slightly differently, with some placing the epidemic's effective close a few years earlier or later than 1930. By whichever precise year you draw the line, the pattern is the same. After roughly 15 years of documented spread across essentially every populated continent, new cases of clearly identifiable Encephalitis lethargica became markedly rarer, and by the early 1930s, the epidemic that had once commanded serious medical attention across the world had largely faded from urgent clinical concern. But, and this is the detail, this story has been building toward an epidemic. Receding does not mean an epidemic's human cost disappearing. When the acute phase of Encephalitis lethargica subsided, it left behind, scattered across hospitals and long-term care institutions in country after country, a population of survivors who had not fully recovered. Some carried mild, manageable tremor or stiffness for the rest of otherwise ordinary lives, but a smaller and considerably more severely affected group of survivors had progressed, in the years following their initial acute illness, into something far more extreme, a condition of profound, lasting rigidity and stillness, the Parkinsonian symptoms mentioned earlier, but taken to their furthest extreme. Patients who could be moved into a position and would then, disconcertingly, hold it. Patients whose faces had lost most of their capacity for expression. Patients who, by the accounts of the institutions that came to house them through the 1930s and beyond, could sometimes be roused briefly to apparent awareness, and would then subside again into stillness that, from the outside, looked very much like a kind of permanent, waking sleep. These were not a handful of unusual cases. Across the countries the epidemic had reached, a meaningful population of these long-term survivors, precise, reliable global figures, do not survive, which is itself worth noting honestly, rather than papering over with an invented number, were admitted, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, to psychiatric hospitals, chronic care institutions, and long-stay wards, often under diagnoses that emphasized their motor symptoms, a form of Parkinsonism. Doctors of the period called it post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, without fully capturing what these institutions' own staff sometimes suspected, and what would not be properly understood for another 4 decades, that a number of these patients might still, behind their stillness, be present. By the mid-1930s, the epidemic itself was medical history. Its survivors were not. They remained, in wards across the world, largely unnoticed by a public and a medical establishment that had moved on to other urgent concerns, a Second World War, arriving within a decade, and with it, a further 4 decades of scientific and social attention pulled, understandably, elsewhere. The wards did not close. The patients did not leave. They simply, over the years that followed, became easier and easier for the wider world to forget. Think, for a moment, about how a society decides what to remember. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed more people, faster, in a more visible and dramatic way, and it has a correspondingly large place in popular historical memory, invoked constantly in public discussion of pandemics and public health ever since. Encephalitis lethargica killed fewer people outright, but left behind something the flu pandemic largely did not, a long tail of survivors whose suffering unfolded, slowly, quietly, inside institutions, over decades rather than weeks. A fast, visible catastrophe tends to be remembered. A slow, hidden one, however severe, tends not to be, not because it matters less, but because there is no single dramatic moment for a society's collective memory to fix itself around. This is, in its way, one of the quieter lessons embedded in this whole story, that the scale of a tragedy and the scale of its remembrance do not always match, and that some of history's most significant losses are the ones that happened slowly enough and privately enough to simply stop being news. The epidemic's decline through the late 1920s was as gradual and as poorly explained in the surviving record as its rise had been. Annual case counts in the cities that had kept the most careful records, Vienna, London, several major American cities, show a real and sustained downward trend across the second half of the decade. But no single intervention, treatment, or public health measure can be credited with producing that decline. This is worth sitting with, because it cuts against a natural narrative instinct. We tend to want epidemics to end because someone did something that ended them. In this case, the honest answer is that nobody did anything identifiable that ended it. The disease appears to have simply run its course, in a manner that remains as mysterious as its arrival. Public and medical attention to the epidemic faded roughly in step with the falling case counts, and by the early 1930s, Encephalitis lethargica had largely disappeared from the pages of major medical journals as an active subject of ongoing case reporting, not because the questions it had raised were resolved, but because the acute disease, whatever had caused it, appeared to have stopped producing large numbers of new cases for physicians to report. What did not fade, though the wider public conversation moved on from it, was the population of long-term survivors left behind patients whose acute illness had ended, in the clinical sense, years or even decades earlier, but whose neurological consequences would continue for the rest of their lives, largely out of public view, in the chronic wards this story is about to turn toward. A number of contemporary and later physicians offered their own theories for why the epidemic declined when it did, and it's worth naming a few of them honestly, precisely because none were ever confirmed. Some suggested that the causative agent, whatever it was, might have simply exhausted the pool of susceptible people in the hardest-hit populations, in the way some infectious diseases naturally decline once enough of a population has already been exposed and developed some form of resistance. Others proposed that public health measures adopted in response to the overlapping 1918 influenza pandemic, improved sanitation, changes in how crowded institutions like schools and military barracks were managed, might have incidentally reduced transmission of whatever was causing encephalitis lethargica as well, even without anyone at the time understanding the connection. Still others wondered whether the responsible agent, if it was an infectious one, might simply have mutated into a less virulent form over time, a pattern seen in some other infectious diseases across their epidemic life cycles. None of these explanations can be confirmed or ruled out using the surviving evidence, and it is worth being honest that this is not a case of historians simply not having looked hard enough. The specific data that would be needed to test any of these hypotheses rigorously detailed, standardized case reporting across the full affected population over the full outbreak period was never collected in the first place, for all the reasons this story has already described: wartime disruption, uneven medical infrastructure, and a disease whose full pattern of spread was only ever partially visible to the physicians documenting it in real time. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with exactly how long that forgetting lasted, because it is the single detail in this story that makes everything that follows land the way it should. Consider what the world looked like to someone institutionalized with post-encephalitic Parkinsonism in, say, 1930, if that person's mind remained, as the strongest available evidence now suggests it often did, largely intact, behind a body that had stopped fully answering. The Second World War had not yet happened. Television did not yet exist in any home. The automobiles on the street outside the hospital window were, by later standards, primitive. Franklin Roosevelt had not yet been elected President of the United States. And then, for a portion of these patients, in institutions that kept them housed, fed, and largely unstimulated for year after year after year, that same static world simply continued. From the inside, while outside the window, everything changed. The Second World War came and ended. The atomic age began. Television arrived in ordinary homes, and then color television. Humanity sent satellites into orbit, and then astronauts. Popular music changed almost beyond recognition 3 or 4 times over. Entire generations were born, grew up, and became adults who had never known a world without those changes, while, in a scattered handful of long-term care wards, a population of patients who had fallen ill as young adults, or even as children in the 1920s, remained, largely unmoving, in rooms that time, for them, had in the most literal clinical sense, nearly stopped inside. This is not a metaphor, or at least not only one. It is, according to the medical record that survives from these institutions, an accurate description of what was happening. Patients who had been admitted in their 20s, in some documented cases, were still there in their 60s, decades later. Having spent the entire span of adult life most people expect to fill with careers, relationships, children, ordinary change, instead inside the same institutional walls, in bodies that, for long stretches, would not reliably obey them. Try for a moment to sit inside that span of time the way it might have felt from the inside, if the strongest available evidence about these patients' retained awareness is accurate. A young person falls ill in, say, 1926, at 19 or 20 years old enough to have already formed a clear sense of who they were, what they wanted, who they loved. By 1930, when the epidemic that caused their illness has effectively ended in the wider world, they are an institutionalized patient in their early 20s, their motor symptoms having progressed to profound rigidity. By 1940, they are in their 30s, and the Second World War is reshaping the entire world outside their ward. By 1950, in their 40s, television is arriving in ordinary homes. By 1960, in their 50s, satellites are orbiting the Earth. Their own body, across all of that time, has by every outward measure remained close to unchanged still, rigid, minimally responsive while inside. If the strongest evidence holds, something like an ordinary consciousness may have continued, watching decades pass through a body that would not let it participate. The medical understanding of these patients through the middle decades of the 20th century tended to treat them, in institutional practice, if not always in individual doctors' private judgment, as a settled, static population chronic cases, unlikely to change, requiring custodial rather than active treatment. It is a reasonable inference, based on the accounts of the clinicians who eventually did engage seriously with these wards, that this institutional pattern was not born of cruelty so much as of a genuine and understandable absence of any treatment that had shown promise for a condition this severe and this old. There was, for decades, simply nothing new to try. It's worth being fair to the doctors and nurses who staffed these wards across those decades, rather than reading the institutional pattern purely as neglect. Medicine in the middle of the 20th century had, by any honest measure, made extraordinary progress against infectious disease, against surgical risk, against 100 conditions that had killed reliably a generation earlier. What it had not made progress against was this: a small, chronic population of patients whose condition had no known treatment, no known cause, and critically, no obvious avenue for productive research, since the disease that caused it had, as an active epidemic, already ended. Research funding and academic interest tend to follow active, growing problems. A fixed, non-expanding population of chronically ill patients, however deserving of attention, rarely attracts either in the same way. This is not a justification so much as an explanation, and it's one that makes what happened next, when someone finally did look closely again, land with real weight. That began to change in the middle of the 1960s, for reasons rooted in an entirely separate line of research into ordinary Parkinson's disease and a new, still experimental drug that researchers believed might restore movement to patients whose brains had lost the ability to produce a chemical the body needs for normal motor control. Into one of these long-term wards in the Bronx in 1969 walked a young British-born neurologist who had, by his own later account, been searching for exactly this kind of forgotten population. It's worth pausing here, at this hinge point in the story, to be honest about something. The 40-year gap this story is about to cross from the epidemic's peak in the early 1920s to Sax's arrival at Beth Abraham in the late 1960s is not a gap in which nothing happened to these patients. It was, for most of them, 4 decades of daily institutional life, routines of feeding, dressing, and basic physical care, carried out by generations of nurses and attendants, who, by every honest account available, generally provided that care with real professional dedication, even as the broader medical culture around them gradually stopped expecting these particular patients to improve, or, in some documented cases, to meaningfully register their surroundings at all. That expectation, the quiet, gradual institutional assumption that a patient's condition, unchanged for years, would simply remain unchanged indefinitely, is not unique to this disease or this historical period. It is a pattern that has recurred in various forms throughout the history of long-term institutional care for patients with severe, stable neurological conditions. And it is one of the reasons this particular story has continued to resonate with clinicians and caregivers working in entirely different fields, decades after the encephalitis lethargica epidemic itself has passed from living memory. The forgotten wards this story is named for were not the product of any particular cruelty. They were the product of something quieter and, in its way, more universal. The slow, understandable, and as this story is about to show, sometimes mistaken process by which sustained stillness comes to be read as permanent absence. It's worth being specific about what daily life actually looked like for the patients who remained in long-term institutional care through these decades, because the phrase, "forgotten wards," can sound more abstract than the reality it describes. Surviving institutional records from chronic care hospitals of this period describe structured daily routines built around basic physical maintenance, scheduled feeding, regular repositioning to prevent pressure injuries in patients unable to move themselves, routine hygiene care, and periodic medical review focused primarily on physical health rather than on any ongoing assessment of cognitive or emotional state, a genuinely custodial model of care, competent and generally humane within its own terms, but not designed to look for or expect to find the kind of inner awareness Sachs would later document. Visiting family members, for those patients who had family able and willing to visit across so many years, describe in surviving letters and later interviews a relationship that had to be sustained without the ordinary feedback, conversation, expression, response that most relationships depend on. Some families visited regularly for years, speaking to a relative who gave no outward sign of registering their presence, out of love and obligation that did not require reciprocation to persist. Others found the absence of any apparent response too painful to sustain over such a long period, and visits gradually became less frequent, a pattern common enough in long-term institutional care generally, that it should not be read as a judgment on any individual family, but rather as one more honest, difficult feature of what this decades-long chapter actually involved for the people living through it, from outside the ward as well as within it. A young doctor arrives. His name was Oliver Sachs, and at the time he first encountered the long-term post-encephalitic patients at Beth Abraham Hospital in the Bronx. He was in his mid-30s, working as a neurologist, in a role that gave him, unusually for the period, real time to simply sit with chronic, institutionalized patients and observe them closely, the same kind of unhurried, detailed clinical observation that had allowed von Economo to see a pattern nobody else had seen, more than 50 years earlier. Sachs had trained in Britain before relocating to the United States, and by his own later account, he arrived at chronic care neurology somewhat sideways, not the most prestigious or fast-moving track a young neurologist of real ability might have chosen, but a posting that suited a particular kind of temperament. Patient, genuinely curious about patients, other parts of the medical system had, in practice, stopped actively studying, and willing to spend long, unglamorous hours simply watching and documenting what chronic, institutionalized patients actually did, hour by hour, rather than relying on the brief, standardized observations that busier clinical settings typically allow. Beth Abraham Hospital, a chronic care institution in the Bronx, housed exactly the kind of long-term population that this approach was suited to, and among that population, prominently, was a group of survivors from the Encephalitis lethargica epidemic of some 40 years earlier, by then elderly or approaching it, many of them profoundly affected by the post-encephalitic Parkinsonism this story has already described. What Sachs found at Beth Abraham was a population of roughly 80 patients, most of them survivors of the Encephalitis lethargica epidemic of the 1920s, now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, many of whom had spent decades in states of profound Parkinsonian rigidity, some so still that hospital staff had, by his own later published account, effectively stopped treating them as patients who might meaningfully respond to their surroundings at all. It is worth being precise about what the record actually supports here, rather than what popular retellings sometimes suggest. Sachs did not discover these patients in some literal sense. The hospital and its staff had, of course, known they were there all along, caring for them daily. What Sachs brought was a different quality of attention, a willingness, informed by his neurological training and by real patients, to look closely at patients whose stillness the broader medical culture had, in a meaningful sense, stopped actively questioning, and to ask whether there might be more happening behind that stillness than institutional practice currently assumed. Sachs documented, in patient after patient, the same details the acute epidemic doctors of the 1920s had described decades earlier, now aged and compounded by 40 additional years of institutional life. Profound rigidity, a loss of the ordinary small movements, blinking, shifting posture, minor facial expression that most people never think about because they happen automatically, and, in the most severely affected patients, states that outwardly resembled a kind of waking trance, held for hours or, in extreme cases, longer, broken only occasionally and briefly. What made Sachs's observation of this population different from the institutional norm that had prevailed for the preceding decades was not any single dramatic discovery, but an accumulation of smaller ones, moments where a patient's eyes seemed to track a visitor's movement with clear purpose, moments where a familiar piece of music produced a flicker of coordinated movement in a patient who showed none otherwise. Moments where, with careful and patient prompting, a response, a word, a gesture, would emerge from a patient who had, by institutional habit, stopped being routinely addressed as though a response were expected at all. It's worth dwelling, briefly, on that detail about music, because it turns out to sit on genuinely solid modern neuroscience, rather than being a piece of sentimental embellishment. The brain's processing of music draws on a broad distributed network of regions, some of which are largely separate from the specific pathways responsible for ordinary voluntary movement, the pathways this disease had damaged so severely. It is a reasonable inference, consistent with what modern neuroscience has since confirmed in other contexts entirely, that music could reach some of Sachs's patients through neural routes the disease had left comparatively intact, even when the routes required for ordinary, deliberate movement remained profoundly blocked. This is part of why music therapy remains, to this day, a genuine and actively used tool in the care of patients with a range of severe movement and neurological disorders, a legacy, in part, of exactly this kind of careful clinical observation. It was against this backdrop a population of patients whose profound stillness Sachs had reasonable clinical grounds to believe was not the whole story, that a new and, at the time, still largely experimental drug entered the picture. The drug was levodopa, generally referred to by its shortened name, L-dopa, a compound the body could convert into dopamine, the same brain chemical whose depletion is understood to underlie the movement difficulties of ordinary Parkinson's disease. L-DOPA had, by the late 1960s, begun showing real promise as a treatment for standard Parkinson's patients, restoring meaningful movement to people whose disease had significantly limited it. The basic logic behind the drug is worth explaining plainly, because it matters for understanding both why it worked as dramatically as it did, and why, later in this story, its effects would prove so difficult to sustain. Dopamine is a chemical messenger the brain uses to help coordinate voluntary movement, among other functions. In ordinary Parkinson's disease, the specific brain cells responsible for producing dopamine gradually die off, and movement becomes progressively harder to initiate and control as the brain's dopamine supply dwindles. Dopamine itself cannot simply be given as a pill or an injection, because it cannot cross the barrier that separates the bloodstream from the brain. L-DOPA can cross that barrier, and once inside the brain, the body converts it into the dopamine the affected cells can no longer adequately produce on their own. Give a Parkinson's patient enough L-DOPA, and at least for a meaningful period, you can substantially restore the brain's dopamine supply, and with it, a great deal of the patient's lost capacity for movement. Sacks's patients, though, did not have ordinary Parkinson's disease in the way the drug's original trials had tested for. Their dopamine-producing cells had been damaged not by the slow, progressive process seen in typical Parkinson's, but by an inflammatory illness contracted decades earlier, whose long-term effects on the relevant brain structures were, in important respects, not fully understood even by the doctors treating these patients daily. Whether a drug developed and validated for one kind of dopamine deficiency would behave the same way in patients whose deficiency had an entirely different origin and a completely different, decades-long history, was genuinely an open question, one with real risk attached. Since a drug this powerful, given to patients this medically fragile, carried no guarantee of a positive outcome and every possibility of a harmful one. In 1969, Sacks began administering L-DOPA to a group of these post-encephalitic patients at Beth Abraham. What happened next would become one of the more remarkable and more genuinely strange documented episodes in the history of modern medicine. It's worth understanding a little more about the institutional world Sacks stepped into, because it shapes how remarkable his approach actually was in context. Chronic care neurology in the 1960s was not, by most accounts of the period, a field that attracted the most ambitious young physicians, nor was it especially well-resourced compared with the acute, high-turnover specialties that dominated hospital medicine's prestige hierarchy. Long-term custodial wards like the one at Beth Abraham typically operated with limited staff time available for the kind of slow, exploratory clinical observation Sacks brought to his patients, the day-to-day pressures of feeding, medicating, and physically caring for a large population of severely disabled patients, generally left little institutional room for the kind of open-ended, curiosity-driven attention a research-minded physician with more flexible time might offer. Sacks himself, in his later writing, was candid about how unusual his own position was, a physician with genuine research training and real intellectual curiosity, placed in a chronic care setting that most of his professional peers would have considered a quiet, unglamorous posting, and choosing to treat that setting not as a professional dead end, but as a genuinely rich, underexplored clinical opportunity. It is this specific combination, real neurological expertise, applied with patience and without the time pressure of a more acute clinical setting, directed at a population the wider medical culture had, in practice, stopped closely studying, that made his observations at Beth Abraham possible in a way they might not have been in almost any other institutional context of the period. Sachs brought to this work a habit of mind that shows clearly in his later writing, an insistence on looking at each patient as an individual case first, and only afterward asking what broader pattern that individual case might illustrate. This is, in a sense, the opposite of how large, busy clinical settings often have to operate, out of sheer necessity, triaging patients quickly, treating presenting symptoms according to established protocols, moving on to the next case. Chronic care neurology at Beth Abraham gave Sachs something increasingly rare in the medical culture of the period: the time to simply watch one patient, closely, for as long as it took to notice something a faster clinical pace would have missed entirely. It's also worth noting that Sachs did not arrive at Beth Abraham with L-DOPA already in mind as a planned intervention for this specific patient population. His initial observations of the ward's patients, the flickers of apparent awareness behind sustained stillness, the responses to music and to familiar voices came first, over a period of sustained clinical attention, and only afterward did the question of whether a pharmacological intervention might reach these patients more fully become a live one. This sequence matters for understanding the nature of the subsequent treatment. It emerged from patient, unhurried observation of a population most of the medical system had stopped closely observing, not from a predetermined research protocol designed in advance to test the drug on this specific group. The decision to try L-DOPA on this population was not made lightly, and Sachs's own account describes real deliberation about the risks involved. A drug developed and tested primarily in a different patient population, being introduced to a group of patients whose decades-long, medically unusual condition made their likely response genuinely uncertain. That uncertainty, and the caution with which the treatment was ultimately begun, is worth remembering as this story moves into what happened next. The effects, when they came with a speed and a completeness that startled even the doctor administering the drug. Patients who had spent years, and in some documented cases decades, in states of profound rigidity, barely able to initiate voluntary movement, some effectively frozen in postures that could be adjusted by another person but not by the patients themselves, began, within days or in some cases even hours of receiving therapeutic doses of L-DOPA, to move again. Not gradually, in the incremental way recovery from illness often proceeds, but in a manner Sachs himself, in his later written accounts, described as startling patients speaking again after years of effective silence, patients walking who had not walked unassisted in decades, patients whose long still faces regained visible expression and animation. It is worth trying to imagine the texture of this from the perspective of the hospital staff who had cared for these patients for years, sometimes decades, before this treatment began. Nurses and attendants who had grown accustomed to a patient's stillness as simply a fixed and permanent fact of that person's daily care, dressing them, feeding them, turning them to prevent bed sores, speaking to them out of professional habit and human decency without necessarily expecting a reply, were, within days, watching that same patient sit up unassisted, meet their eyes with evident recognition, and speak. For staff who had, understandably, come to think of these patients' conditions as essentially unchanging, this was not a gradual, expected clinical improvement. It was something closer to what the word awakening genuinely implies: a return, sudden enough to be disorienting for everyone in the room, not only the patient. Sachs documented the range of what these patients experienced and expressed in those first weeks with real care. Some patients, upon regaining fuller movement and speech, expressed something close to disbelief at their own capacity to move again. Bodies that had, in some cases, not reliably obeyed conscious will in 20 or 30 years, suddenly answering. Others focused, more than anything, on the people around them. Family members some had not been able to meaningfully greet or converse with in years. Hospital staff, whose faces had become familiar over long institutional years, but whose voices, in some cases, patients were now hearing and responding to with a clarity that had not been possible before. And running underneath nearly all of these individual responses, according to the pattern Sachs documented, was the disorienting task of confronting how much time had actually passed patients, whose most recent clear memories predated the Second World War, finding themselves, now, in a world of jet travel and moon landings, and a popular culture that had cycled through several complete transformations since the world they last remembered clearly. It is worth being careful here about exactly what can and cannot be claimed with confidence. Popular retellings of this story, including the well-known 1990 film adaptation of Sachs's published account, starring Robert De Niro and Robin Williams, which brought this history to a far wider audience than the original medical literature ever reached, have, understandably, dramatized and compressed events for narrative effect. This script draws on Sachs's own published clinical account rather than the film's dramatization, and it's important to note plainly that some of the more specific, emotionally vivid details attached to individual patients in popular memory of this story, particular remembered conversations, particular described reactions come to us through Sachs's own written narrative voice, a genuinely careful physician's account, but a narrative account nonetheless, rather than a raw, unmediated clinical transcript. Where this script describes what patients experienced or said, it is drawing on that documented published account, not inventing detail beyond it. What the record supports with real confidence is this. For a meaningful number of Sachs's post-encephalitic patients at Beth Abraham, the administration of L-DOPA in 1969 produced dramatic, rapid, and this is the crucial word, genuinely functional restoration of movement, speech, and engagement with the world, after years or decades of near-total stillness. Patients who had not spoken meaningfully in years held conversations. Patients who had not walked did so, sometimes for the first time in their adult lives fully independently, for a period that, for most of the affected patients, would prove to last weeks rather than years. Something that looked very much like a genuine awakening had occurred. News of what was happening at Beth Abraham spread, in time, well beyond the hospital's own walls. And reasonably so, it is difficult to overstate how unusual it was, in the medical culture of 1969, for patients written off for decades as essentially unreachable to demonstrate this kind of dramatic, functional recovery from a single pharmacological intervention. Sachs himself approached the phenomenon with a combination of genuine wonder and real scientific caution, meticulously documenting each patient's individual response rather than treating the group's improvement as uniform. Not every patient responded identically. Dosage, timing, and individual variation in how each patient's brain and body handled the drug all shaped outcomes that ranged from modest, partial improvement to the kind of dramatic, near-total functional restoration that would go on to define the popular memory of this story. Sachs documented these changes carefully, patient by patient, publishing his account in 1973 under the title Awakenings, a record that would go on to influence not only medical understanding of post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, but, through its later stage and film adaptations, the general public's awareness that this entire epidemic and its long institutional aftermath had ever happened at all. The book's title itself became, in time, the phrase most closely associated with this whole history, a single word carrying the weight of everything this story has spent the last several rooms building toward. But, and Sachs himself was honest about this in his own published account, in a way, this story owes him the honesty of preserving the awakening did not, for most of these patients, last. The practical process of administering L-Dopa to this specific patient population required real caution, and Sachs's own account describes an approach that was gradual and closely monitored rather than a single dramatic mass administration. Doses were, in most cases, started low and increased incrementally, with each patient's response tracked individually, a necessary precaution, given how little precedent existed for using this specific drug on patients whose underlying condition differed so substantially from the standard Parkinson's disease population the drug had originally been tested on. Even with this caution, the speed and intensity of some patients' responses caught the clinical team by surprise. There was, by Sachs's own account, no way to have fully predicted in advance just how dramatically some individual patients would respond, given how novel this specific application of the drug was. The hospital environment itself had to adapt quickly to what was happening. Staff accustomed to a ward of largely still, minimally interactive patients found themselves, within a matter of days in some cases, managing patients who could walk, talk, express clear preferences, and in some cases become frustrated or distressed by aspects of their care that they had had no prior ability to object to. This required real adjustments to daily routines and to how staff related to patients they had, for years, cared for primarily as bodies requiring maintenance rather than as people capable of active participation in decisions about their own care. Sachs documented this institutional adjustment as its own significant part of the story, not simply a medical event happening to patients, but a genuine, sometimes disorienting transformation of the ward's entire social and caregiving fabric. Beyond the patient's own responses, the ripple effects extended to families who had, in many cases, effectively grieved a living relative years earlier, visiting out of devotion and duty, but without any real expectation of engagement or recognition. For some of these families, the awakening meant a genuinely unexpected reunion, a parent, sibling, or spouse suddenly able to hold a conversation, ask after people and events from the intervening decades, and in some documented cases, express clear affection and recognition that had not been possible in years. Sachs's account treats these family reunions with particular care, aware of how emotionally significant they were, and equally aware, even in that first joyful period, of how uncertain their duration would prove to be. It is worth returning, briefly, to the question of what these patients actually experienced during those first days and weeks, because Sachs's account resists the temptation to describe it as a uniformly joyful event, even before the later complications set in. For some patients, the sudden return of full awareness after years or decades of profound stillness carried its own genuine distress, a disorienting confrontation with lost time that could not simply be waved away by the relief of regained movement. Patients who had last held a clear, continuous memory of the world before the Second World War were now being asked, in effect, to absorb the fact that entire decades of history, technological change, and personal loss had occurred while they were, in the most literal sense, unable to participate in or even register any of it. Some patients responded to this with what Sachs described as a kind of grief distinct from anything directly caused by their physical illness, grief for time itself, for relationships that had changed or ended, for a world that no longer matched the one preserved in their last clear memories. This detail matters for understanding why this story resists being told as simple triumph. The medical achievement was real. Patients who could not move, moved. Patients who could not speak, spoke. But the human experience underlying that medical achievement was considerably more complicated than a straightforward happy outcome. And Sacks's own willingness to document that complexity honestly, rather than smoothing it into a simpler and more comfortable narrative, is a significant part of why his account has remained a respected piece of medical writing, rather than merely an inspiring anecdote. The broader medical community's reaction to what was happening at Beth Abraham developed gradually, rather than all at once. Sacks did not initially present his findings as a triumphant cure. His own caution about drawing premature conclusions from a small, medically unusual patient population meant that his early communications about the treatment's effects were considerably more measured than the popular retellings that would eventually follow. Colleagues who visited the ward to observe the patients directly described reactions ranging from genuine astonishment to a more cautious scientific interest in understanding exactly what mechanism could produce such a dramatic and rapid functional change in patients whose underlying brain damage was, by any standard clinical measure, both old and severe. One detail worth sitting with a little longer is how patients themselves described, where they were able to describe it at all, what the preceding decades had actually felt like from the inside. Sacks's account records a range of patient responses to this question, and they are not uniform. Some patients described their prolonged stillness as something closer to a kind of muted, distant awareness, able to perceive some of what was happening around them, without the capacity to respond or fully engage. Others described the experience as far less continuous, closer to intermittent awareness, separated by long stretches, with no clear memory at all. Still others, once their capacity for speech returned, struggled to describe the intervening period in any coherent terms and understandable difficulty, given how far outside ordinary human experience decades of profound, medically induced stillness actually is. This variation matters because it cautions against treating the forgotten wards, as though every patient within them experienced the same inner reality behind an outwardly similar physical presentation. What Sacks's careful documentation actually supports is narrower and more honest. That at least some patients, in ways that varied considerably from person to person, retained meaningfully more inner awareness than their outward stillness, had led decades of caregivers to assume not a uniform claim about every patient's inner experience, which the evidence does not support, but a genuine and clinically significant caution against assuming uniform absence. Within weeks of their initial, often dramatic improvement, a substantial number of Sacks's patients began developing complications, involuntary movements, fluctuations between periods of improved function and periods of relapse, and for many, over the following months, a gradual return of the rigidity and stillness the drug had initially, so strikingly, lifted. Adjusting the dosage helped some patients temporarily, but for most, the drug's benefits proved impossible to sustain at the level or with the stability of those first remarkable weeks. The specific complications that emerged are worth naming because they illustrate just how delicately balanced this treatment turned out to be. Some patients developed involuntary, uncontrollable movements, a kind of excess of motor activity that was, in its own way, as disruptive to ordinary functioning as the rigidity had been, just in the opposite direction. Others found the drug's benefits becoming unpredictable day to day, functioning well in the morning and relapsing into rigidity by afternoon, or the reverse, in patterns that proved difficult for Sachs and his colleagues to manage, even with careful, individualized dosage adjustment. Still others experienced psychological and behavioral changes alongside the physical fluctuations, heightened emotional intensity, in some cases genuine distress, that added a further layer of difficulty to an already delicate clinical situation. Sachs, to his considerable credit as both a physician and as the person who would go on to document this story for the world, did not minimize any of this in his published account. He described the disease's return, for many patients, as its own kind of tragedy, layered directly on top of the original one. This is, in its own way, as important a part of this story as the initial awakening itself, and it is worth resisting the temptation one popular retellings sometimes give into to treat the relapse as a simple, tragic footnote to an otherwise triumphant medical breakthrough. The relapse was not incidental for the patients who experienced it, and for the families and caregivers who had, in some cases, just begun rebuilding a relationship with someone they had not been able to meaningfully communicate with in years. The gradual return of symptoms represented a second loss, layered directly on top of the first, arguably a more painful one, because it came after hope had been not just offered, but, for a real stretch of weeks, genuinely delivered. Sachs wrote about this period, in his own published account, with a clear-eyed honesty about both the genuine wonder of what he had witnessed and the real limits of what the drug could ultimately provide. He did not claim to have cured post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. What he documented, and what stands as the honest legacy of this episode, is narrower and in some ways more remarkable than a cure would have been. Proof, for a defined and limited window, that patients who had been treated for years as effectively unreachable retained, behind their stillness, genuine cognitive and emotional presence, an awareness of themselves, of time passing, of the people around them that a purely custodial model of their care had for decades had no way of recognizing. That proof mattered beyond the specific patients involved. It changed, in ways that extended well past Beth Abraham Hospital, how the broader medical and caregiving community thought about patients in profoundly still, minimally responsive states, a caution against assuming that outward stillness reliably indicates inward absence, a caution that would go on to inform care practices for other conditions entirely, in the decades that followed. Clinicians treating patients in comas, in minimally conscious states following brain injury, and in other conditions where the outward signs of awareness are ambiguous or absent, would go on, in the decades after Sachs' work became widely known, to approach those patients with a similar caution, a professional and ethical shift, that this specific, strange episode in the Bronx played a genuine, documented role in encouraging, even in fields of medicine, with no direct connection to encephalitis lethargica. For the families involved, the arc of hope followed by partial or complete relapse left a complicated legacy that Sachs's written account treats with real honesty rather than false comfort. Some families described the experience of those weeks, however they ultimately resolved, as something they would not have traded away, even knowing how it would end. A chance, however brief, to speak again with someone they loved, to be recognized, to say things that institutional silence had made impossible for years. Others found the return of symptoms after such a vivid reawakening almost unbearably painful, a loss experienced twice rather than once. Both responses appear in the historical record, and this script does not claim that one was more common or more representative than the other, only that both were real, and both were part of what this treatment actually cost and actually gave to the people who lived through it most directly. For the individual patients themselves, the outcomes varied. Some maintained a degree of improved function, at a reduced level, for a meaningful period after the initial dramatic awakening faded. Others returned, over the following months and years, close to their pre-treatment state. What none of the patients Sachs documented experienced was a full, lasting return to the stillness of before, as though the awakening had never happened at all. The experience of having been reached, however briefly, appears by every account to have mattered, to the patients themselves and to the people who loved them, regardless of how the following months unfolded. The complications that emerged in the weeks following the initial awakening followed a pattern that, in hindsight, connects to the underlying pharmacology in a way Sachs and his colleagues had to work out largely through direct clinical observation, since no prior patient population had ever been treated with L-DOPA under quite these conditions. The drug's effects, it became clear, were not simply a matter of restoring a fixed, stable level of dopamine that then remained steady over time. Instead, patients' responses fluctuated sometimes, across a single day, in ways that made consistent dosing genuinely difficult. A dose that produced good functional movement in the morning might, by afternoon, produce either a relapse into rigidity or, in the opposite direction, an excess of uncontrolled movement, and adjusting the dose to correct one problem risked producing the other. Sachs and his colleagues experimented with a range of approaches to manage this instability, adjusting timing, adjusting dosage, in some cases combining L-DOPA with other medications, in an effort to smooth out the fluctuations. Some patients responded well to these adjustments for extended periods. Others proved resistant to nearly every combination attempted, cycling between improved function and relapse regardless of how carefully their treatment was managed. This variability itself became an important part of what the Beth Abraham experience taught the broader medical community about L-DOPA lessons that, in time, informed how the drug came to be used more cautiously and more individually in the treatment of ordinary Parkinson's disease as well beyond the specific post-encephalitic population Sachs was working with. For the patients experiencing this instability directly, the psychological toll was considerable. Having regained, however briefly, a level of engagement with the world that had been unavailable to them for decades, many patients were acutely aware of every fluctuation, moments of returning rigidity, experienced not as a neutral clinical event, but as a frightening, sometimes distressing loss of newly recovered capacities they had only just begun to trust as real and ongoing. Sachs documented this psychological dimension of the relapse with the same careful attention he had given to the initial awakening, treating his patients throughout as full participants in their own experience, rather than simply as subjects whose neurological status was being tracked from the outside. Beyond the individual clinical story, the Beth Abraham experience left a lasting mark on how the medical and caregiving professions approached long-term institutional patients more broadly. And this influence is worth tracing a little further than the immediate ward itself. In the years following Sachs's published account, the specific caution his work embodied, the reminder that outward stillness should never be assumed without real investigation, to indicate an absence of inner awareness, found its way into training and practice guidelines for clinicians working with patients in comas, in minimally conscious states following traumatic brain injury, and in advanced stages of degenerative neurological disease. This influence was rarely direct or explicitly cited. It operated more as a shift in professional culture, a slowly accumulating caution against the kind of premature institutional certainty that had, for decades, governed how the post-encephalitic patients at Beth Abraham were treated before Sachs's arrival. It would be an overstatement to credit one physician's work at one hospital with single-handedly transforming an entire field of care, The shift in how medicine approaches minimally responsive patients has many contributing sources, and this remains, honestly, one strand among several rather than the sole cause. But among clinicians and medical historians who have studied this specific period, the Beth Abraham case is consistently cited as one of the clearest, most vivid documented instances of exactly the kind of mistaken certainty this broader professional shift was responding to, which is part of why this particular story has continued to be taught, decades later, well beyond the specific disease that produced it. More than a century after von Economo's first 6 cases, and more than half a century after Saxe's patients briefly reawakened in the Bronx, the central mystery at the heart of this story remains genuinely, honestly, unresolved. No surviving record, historical, clinical, or modern molecular, tells us with confidence exactly what caused encephalitis lethargica, why it moved through the world with the specific intensity and timing it did across roughly a decade and a half, or why it appeared to recede in the years around 1930 nearly as mysteriously as it had arrived. What has changed in the decades since is not the answer, but the sophistication of the questions researchers are now able to ask. Modern immunology and genetics have given scientists tools von Economo, and even Saxe could not have had access to the ability, for instance, to study preserved tissue samples for genetic traces of viral infection, and the ability to characterize, with real precision, the immune mechanisms behind newer, better understood conditions that produce strikingly similar symptoms. It's worth pausing on what it actually means for a hypothesis to remain live for over 100 years, without being confirmed or ruled out. In most fields of active scientific inquiry, a question this well studied would, by now, have either been answered or been narrowed down to a very small number of remaining live possibilities. Encephalitis lethargica sits in an unusual middle ground, not so obscure that nobody has tried to solve it, but constrained by evidence that is, in the most literal sense, a century old and largely non-renewable. New patients are not developing this specific historical epidemic today for researchers to study directly. What survives is preserved tissue, contemporary written accounts, and inference, a genuinely harder set of tools to work with than the ones available to researchers studying an active, ongoing disease. That second line of research deserves particular attention because it represents the strongest current lead science has toward finally understanding what happened a century ago. In recent decades, researchers have identified and characterized a group of modern autoimmune encephalitis conditions, cases in which a patient's own immune system, sometimes triggered by an unrelated prior infection, attacks specific structures within the brain, producing symptoms that can include profound movement disorders, disturbances in sleep and wakefulness, and psychiatric changes strikingly reminiscent of what was documented during the encephalitis lethargica epidemic. Some researchers studying this connection have proposed that the historical epidemic may have represented an early, unrecognized instance of a similar autoimmune process, the body's own defenses. Rather than a specific pathogen acting directly, doing the damage, possibly triggered by exposure to any of several different infections common in the crowded, wartime world of the late 1910s, rather than by one specific virus alone. This remains, honestly, a hypothesis rather than a settled finding the strongest available current lead, not a confirmed answer. It has not been, and by the nature of the evidence available from events a century past, may never be possible to confirm with the kind of certainty modern medicine typically expects before closing a case. Modern autoimmune encephalitis, where doctors have been able to study it directly in living patients with the full range of contemporary diagnostic tools, provides a genuinely useful point of comparison, even without confirming the historical link. Patients with these modern conditions can present with movement disorders, disturbances in sleep and wakefulness, and psychiatric symptoms that, described side by side with the century-old case notes from Vienna and beyond, read as strikingly familiar. Crucially, many of these modern autoimmune conditions are treatable not with L-DOPA, which addresses only the downstream symptom of dopamine deficiency, but with treatments that address the underlying immune process directly, allowing many modern patients to recover far more fully than anything available to Encephalitis lethargica's original victims. This is, in its way, one of the more hopeful notes this story can honestly offer. If the current leading hypothesis is correct, a disease that devastated a generation with no available treatment shares a plausible mechanism with a modern condition that, in many cases, can now be treated effectively, a form of progress that, while it cannot undo what happened between 1917 and 1930, at least suggests something has genuinely been learned. There's a further, quieter question this history leaves behind, one that receives less attention than the search for a historical cause, but which arguably matters more for anyone listening to this story today. Could something like this happen again? Here, too, honesty requires resisting a tidy answer. Autoimmune and post-infectious neurological conditions, of the general type researchers now suspect may explain the historical epidemic, continue to be diagnosed today, rarer, better understood, and in most cases, now treatable in ways nothing available to von Economos or even Sachs's generation could offer, but real and still occurring. Whether the specific set of conditions that produced an epidemic on the scale seen between 1917 and 1930 could recur in the modern world is not a question current medical science can answer with confidence in either direction. Modern epidemiological surveillance, genetic sequencing capable of identifying novel pathogens within days rather than decades, and a century of accumulated understanding of autoimmune neurological mechanisms all mean that a cluster of symptoms resembling encephalitis lethargica appearing today would very likely be recognized, investigated, and responded to on a timescale von Economo could not have imagined. Whether that faster recognition would be enough to prevent a similarly severe outcome, if the underlying cause turned out to be something genuinely novel and genuinely resistant to modern treatment, is a separate question this story cannot answer either, and it would be dishonest, on a channel built on careful, evidence-respecting storytelling, to pretend otherwise. The case count question, how many people, in total, Encephalitis lethargica actually affected across its documented run, also remains genuinely disputed among the sources that survive. In a way, this story has tried not to paper over. Some accounts place the toll at just over 1 million people affected worldwide, with roughly 500,000 deaths. Other accounts, drawing on different assumptions about how many milder or misdiagnosed cases went uncounted, place the number of people infected considerably higher, into the millions. The honest answer, a century on, is that no precise, universally agreed figure exists, and that the true scale of what this disease did to the world may simply be, at this distance, unrecoverable in exact numbers, one more thing this story cannot promise to resolve. It's worth spending a little more time on why a century-old epidemic remains this resistant to modern investigative techniques, because the honest answer says something important about the limits of even very sophisticated modern science when applied to historical evidence. Researchers today have, in principle, tools like polymerase chain reaction testing and next-generation genetic sequencing that can detect vanishingly small traces of viral genetic material in preserved tissue samples, tools that have, in other historical disease investigations, successfully identified pathogens responsible for outbreaks decades or even centuries old. Applying these tools to encephalitis lethargica requires well-preserved brain tissue from confirmed cases, and the surviving supply of such tissue is extremely limited. A small number of archived specimens held in a handful of medical collections, most of them decades old and not originally preserved with genetic analysis in mind. Several research teams have examined available archived tissue samples over the years, and none have produced a confirmed, widely accepted identification of a causative pathogen. This is itself informative. It does not rule out a viral cause, but it means that if a specific virus was responsible, either it left no genetic trace detectable by current methods in the specific samples examined, or the true cause was never viral in the direct sense at all, which is part of why the autoimmune hypothesis has gained real traction among researchers in recent decades. The disputed case count figures deserve a slightly closer look as well, since the range between different scholarly estimates is wide enough to matter. The commonly cited figure of roughly 1 million people affected, with approximately half that number dying during the acute epidemic, derives primarily from case counts and mortality records kept by the public health authorities of major cities with relatively robust record-keeping systems at the time, figures that are reasonably well documented, but that almost certainly undercount cases in regions with less developed public health infrastructure, in rural areas with limited access to hospitals capable of correctly diagnosing the disease, and in the many documented instances of misdiagnosis this story has already discussed. Some historians studying the epidemic have argued the true global total, accounting for these gaps, likely ran considerably higher, though, by how much remains, honestly, a matter of scholarly estimation rather than confirmed fact, given how much of the necessary underlying data simply does not survive in a form that could resolve the question definitively today. Some did, briefly, remarkably, and for most of them only for a season, in the Bronx, in 1969, more than 40 years after the epidemic that first put them to sleep had ended. For that brief window, patients who had been treated, not unkindly but nearly universally, as beyond meaningful reach, proved to be nothing of the kind. They had been there, behind their stillness, the whole time. That's worth letting settle for a moment, on its own, before we close. An entire population of people, treated for decades as essentially unreachable, turned out to have been reachable all along, not because anyone had been careless or unkind, but because nobody had yet found the specific, unlikely key that happened to fit. It's a story about a disease, and about a mystery science still hasn't solved. But underneath that, it's also a story about the particular danger of deciding, too early and too permanently, that someone is no longer there to be reached. Most of the roughly 1 million people affected by encephalitis lethargica between 1917 and 1930 were never reached that way at all. A third died in the epidemic's acute phase. Many of the survivors recovered, more or less fully, and lived out ordinary lives that the historical record, understandably, has not tracked individually. And a smaller group, the group this story has spent the most time with, spent decades in institutions, in a stillness the world outside their windows had, for the most part, simply stopped thinking about, until one young doctor's willingness to look closely changed that, for a handful of them, for a little while. The cause of their illness remains unknown. Not unknown in the sense of a mystery nobody has bothered to investigate, genuinely, carefully, repeatedly investigated, across a century, by researchers with tools each generation believed might finally be sufficient to close the case, but unknown in the more honest and more unusual sense. A real, documented, world-spanning epidemic. One that killed hundreds of thousands of people and altered the lives of hundreds of thousands more, whose fundamental cause medicine still cannot state with confidence, even now. There's something worth sitting with, on a channel built to help you sleep, in a story about a disease that took sleep away from an entire generation, and then, decades later, briefly gave a small number of its survivors something like their lives back, before taking that too. It isn't a comfortable story, exactly, but it is, in its way, a gentle one, a reminder that stillness, however complete it looks from the outside, does not always mean absence, that attention, paid carefully enough and patiently enough, can still find someone who has been there all along, and that some of the most important, most human parts of a story 100 years old are, even now, not yet finished being understood. We opened tonight by telling you this was a sleep channel, telling a story about sleep, and it's worth returning to that, one last time, now that you know the whole of it. Encephalitis lethargica took sleep away from a generation, and never gave a satisfying answer for why. Decades later, in that quiet ward in the Bronx, something like waking briefly returned to people the world had stopped expecting to wake at all. Tonight, on this channel, in your own bed, sleep is doing something far kinder than it did for any of them, and that difference, small as it sounds, is worth being grateful for. If tonight's story helped you drift off somewhere along the way, that's exactly what this channel is for. There'll be another one here tomorrow night. If you're still awake and it moved you the way it moved me putting it together, a like and a subscribe genuinely help this small channel keep going. And I'd still love to know, whenever you read this, where in the world you were listening from tonight. Rest well. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, you've done enough for one night. There is no tidy moral to close this with, and this channel has never promised you one. What there is, instead, is a century-old reminder, still quietly relevant, that the line between stillness and absence is not always where it looks like it is, and that some of the kindest, most careful attention anyone can offer another person is simply the willingness to keep checking.